You have a furry friend, you might have noticed that veterinary care is becoming increasingly expensive. And as prices rise, attention is turning to a major shift in the industry. Private equity firms and large corporations buying up veterinary practices across the country. Paul Solman has the story.
Clyde, a 9-year-old boxer who lived in California with pet parent Kylie.
I adopted him in April of 2020, so he's a pandemic baby. He was in mostly good health for about a year, and then he started vomiting pretty regularly.
After a year plus of vet visits, Sweet Potato Clyde's diagnosis, cancer.
We started him on chemo pretty early on.
Costing how much?
In 2026 alone, and just for my one dog, Clyde, I have spent $3,500.
At what point do you say enough?
Jennifer Turnauer has spent some $20,000 on her daughter's beloved 14-year-old Balinese cat, Jupiter.
If it was $20,000 all at once, I might have said no. But because it was a few thousand, then a few years passed, then a few thousand, it's really hard to draw a clear line.
Look, we can bombard you with stories like these because veterinary care costs have risen by roughly 60% since 2014, far outpacing overall inflation. The mission of this story, to examine the role of corporate ownership, by private equity in particular.
Rising prices are partly a story of inflation. They're partly a story of better medicine, partly a story of labor scarcity, and then it's partly a story of ownership and market structure.
Economist Matt Saloy studies the industry.
And so the private equity component is a piece of that story.
Saloy says it's hard to precisely quantify private equity's share of these costs, but they are real enough. And in fact, Clyde and Juniper have something in common besides their pathologies. They were treated by vets owned by the same private equity firm. Now, as we and others have reported, private equity buys businesses to hike their value, usually with a loan that's loaded onto the acquisition. The goal? Increase profits and sell at a higher price.
Private equity has started to move in very aggressively into the veterinary space.
Financial journalist Helene Olin.
And what often happens is everyone from the customers to the employees get the short end of the stick. There's a lot of evidence out there now that what they do is they put a lot of pressure on the veterinary clinics themselves to increase revenue. They raise prices quickly and often.
Saloy says that can happen, but in the vet world, so much depends on how the acquirers operate and how many practices they own.
The entry of private equity into a veterinary practice in and itself is not good or bad. It's what kind of operating model. I think the problem here is one of size. It's easier for a smaller enterprise to maintain that level of trust between the veterinary team and the pet owner because the distance between decision maker and decision implementer is closer. And that becomes harder as an enterprise grows, as can happen in a corporate veterinary practice.
In other words, the practice can wind up putting profits over pets. A government-backed investigation of vet clinics in the UK estimated that corporate ownership added more than $1 billion in costs for consumers over a 5-year period. Back here across the pond, corporations owned only 10% of vet practices a decade ago. Today, it's estimated from about 30 to as much as 50%. And in specialty care, emergency medicine, oncology, and cardiology, 75%. Why? Because vet practices can be cash cows, given the emotional bonds between man and beast.
Happy birthday to you.
If you're a pet owner that loves your pet, you're going to want to keep that pet alive. They're my babies. They're my kids.
It's very hard to say no when something might extend their life.
The status of pets in our society has gone up by a huge degree over the course of our lifetimes. These private equity places, shops, see this and they think this is a guaranteed way to make money because people would just keep spending money on their pets.
Stand a man.
Michelle Forbes is a veterinarian who runs an independent vet practice in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
When I started 22 years ago, it was you had to be a veterinarian to own your practice. It was a more locally functioning, connected, sort of we make decisions here in the moment in the hospital. And now it's just much more business. It's a business venture.
Vets like Forbes are increasingly getting offers to sell their practices to private equity firms. Here's a recent bid she got and posted on TikTok.
Initial corporate offer, $8.5 million.
I, on a daily basis, will get requests from private equity companies to purchase my practice, and the numbers are so hard to walk away from.
And she has walked away from every offer.
That's what we think of selling to corporate.
Even so, she says, the rise of corporate-owned practices has made it harder for her to compete.
There are certain medications that for every dollar I spend, a corporate hospital spends 30 cents. So when I charge a client the same amount as a private equity, my profit margin is so slim that it's hard to stay alive.
That's because she can't get the same huge volume discounts that come with size. But when vets like her sell or close up shop, the community may pay the price.
Private equity, consolidation in general, has the potential to reduce competition in local markets. And so if that happens, that pressure does contribute to higher prices. Independent practices, they're not just nostalgic. They are an important competitive force.
We contacted some of the largest corporate-owned veterinary groups in the U.S. Mars, the Candy Folks, now a conglomerate which owns 3 of those groups and about 2,000 U.S. practices in all, responded, quote, diagnostics, treatments, and specialty care that did not exist a generation ago are helping pets live longer, healthier lives. Those advances, along with industry-wide pressures such as a national shortage of veterinary professionals and rising costs for medical supplies and equipment, have affected the cost of care. Our veterinarians have clinical autonomy. Mars rebrands its vet practices, but that's not usual for private equity owners. So consumers often assume local ownership. Francis Wang's dachshund Pluto was sideswiped by a car, rushed to a local clinic.
And we were just really disappointed in the way he was cared for. There didn't seem to be any continuity of care. The vets that he saw were relief vets, so they were coming in and out. And so they missed the internal bleeding that he had. And that's ultimately what led to his death. And the other thing that was really tortuous for us was just the way in which they were continually asking for additional authorization for payment, including after he had passed.
Did you know it was private equity?
So we didn't. We complained. We didn't really hear anything back. And at that point, I started researching, who owns the practice.
The local vet had been acquired by a private equity firm, KKR. Wang appealed, was offered a refund of his $13,000 bill, but...
And that was in return for an NDA.
A non-disclosure agreement.
Meaning that we wouldn't be able to share anything about our experience. And so instead, what I decided to do was to try and honor Pluto in some way by setting up this website that actually has the goal of bringing transparency to the ownership of veterinary practices across the U.S.
His website, privateequityvet.org, features a searchable map of corporate-owned practices, something he wishes he had had when he lost Pluto. Just a pet, some might say, but like so many, a priceless member of the family. For the PBS News Hour, Paul Solman.
Support journalism you trust. Support PBS News. Donate now, or even better, start a monthly contribution today.